I'm her mother-in-law, not her maid, not her landlord, not her doormat. Still, she said it anyway. You don't contribute anything. Right after dinner I paid for. As I wiped down the counters she never touched, I opened the drawer with the deed in my name. While she bragged online about our house, I filed the papers that would remind her whose house it really was. The same voice that dismissed me is about to read my silence on legal letterhead. That's when I posted the notice. 30 days to contribute somewhere else. All right. Before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The clink of silverware against plates echoed through the kitchen as Carolyn gathered the dishes, the weight of each one grounding her in the quiet that hung in the air. The faint buzz of the dishwasher running was the only sound beside the quiet murmur of Shannon's voice in the background. Carolyn didn't look at her daughter-in-law, not as she scraped leftover food into the trash, not as she stacked the plates with care, just as she always did, even after all these months. The rhythm of it was familiar, comforting. She could almost do it without thinking. But then came the sentence. Shannon's eyes were fixed on her phone, her fingers scrolling idly through the screen as she leaned back in her chair, one leg crossed over the other. You don't contribute anything around here, she said, voice flat but cutting, as if the words were as insignificant as the air around them. Carolyn froze mid-motion. The spoon she had been holding, its handle slick with soap, slipped from her fingers and clattered against the sink. She hadn't heard it at first, not with the rush of her thoughts and the constant noise in her head from the past weeks, but now it was there. Her daughter-in-law's words, lodged deep like a stone in her chest. She didn't respond immediately. She wiped the counter with slow, deliberate strokes, first once, then twice, letting the motion steady her, as though erasing the crumbs could erase the sting of the insult. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the counter, the smooth granite a sharp contrast to the jagged feeling rising within her. Evan sat a few feet away, his shoulders hunched, staring into his plate. He didn't look up. Carolyn's gaze shifted to him, then back to the mess she was cleaning up. But no words came from his mouth, not a single one to defend her. Thanks for dinner, she said, keeping her voice neutral. She didn't know if it was directed at Shannon or Evan. Maybe both. She wasn't sure she wanted it to be. The kitchen felt too small now, the air thick with the weight of everything unsaid. Shannon didn't acknowledge the thanks. She just kept scrolling on her phone, her focus locked onto the small screen in her hands. Carolyn's fingers tightened on the dishcloth, twisting it as if to wring out every emotion she refused to speak. She let the silence stretch, feeling it grow thicker, as if the room itself could fill with all the things they hadn't said to each other in months. When the last of the plates were stacked, the kitchen finally seemed quieter. Carolyn moved to the sink, rinsing out the last of the dishes with measured care. As she turned to hang the dishcloth, she caught sight of herself in the reflection of the window above the sink, her face pale in the dim light. It was as if she were looking at a stranger, someone who had grown accustomed to a quiet pain, a woman who had accepted being taken for granted. She didn't want to be that woman anymore. That night, after dinner was over and the house had fallen into a strained sort of stillness, Carolyn found herself standing in front of the filing cabinet in her bedroom closet. The soft glow of the bedside lamp cast long shadows across the room, making the cabinet seem larger, more imposing than it was. She didn't hesitate. Her hand reached for the handle, fingers curling around the cool metal. She pulled it open with a sound that felt too loud in the quiet house, like a door creaking open after years of being left shut. Inside, everything was in its place, documents neatly stacked, each one a reminder of what had been hers long before Shannon had ever stepped through the door. There were mortgage statements, tax filings, receipts. The home was hers. Carolyn had paid it off long ago, her quiet sacrifice hidden beneath layers of routine. Her fingers skimmed over the papers. She didn't need to look at them to know exactly where to go. Her hand slid to the bottom drawer where the deed sat, crisp and untouched, just like everything she had allowed herself to ignore. A soft breath escaped her lips, steadying herself. She pulled out the deed, feeling its weight in her hands. The paper felt like nothing and everything at once. It was her claim, her right. She hadn't let anyone forget that this house was hers, not Shannon, not even Evan, though he still seemed too afraid to choose. She hadn't thought she needed to do anything more. Until now. With one last glance at the still quiet house, Carolyn slid the deed into a folder and carefully closed the filing cabinet. She didn't look back as she left the room. The night was still young, and the quiet was settling over her like a second skin. But she knew that it wouldn't last. Not anymore. Tomorrow, things would change. And this time, she wouldn't let anyone forget who had contributed everything. The kitchen table was bathed in soft morning light, the shadows of the overhead light fixture dancing across the scattered papers. Carolyn sat across from Haley, who was flipping through the papers with practiced ease. The two of them hadn't spoken much yet, only the occasional murmur about the weather, or a comment about the coffee, but neither of them had needed to say anything more. The kitchen was still, save for the rustling of paper, as though the house itself was waiting, holding its breath. Carolyn's fingers drummed nervously on the edge of her coffee cup. She had never been one for paperwork, not the way Haley was, not the way Rachel would be. But today, it felt necessary. Every paper before her was a weapon, every word printed on it, a shield. Haley paused, her eyes narrowing as she scanned one of the mortgage statements. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose and sighed as if the numbers alone told the story they both already knew. "This house is in your name and Evan's," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. She was pointing at a document, one of the mortgage papers Carolyn had kept with meticulous care, tucked away in the file folders she had organized for years. Carolyn nodded, but it wasn't a simple acknowledgement. She felt the weight of the words settle in her chest, and for the first time since Shannon's comment, she allowed herself to feel something raw, a reminder that it wasn't just about the house. It was about the years she had spent watching others walk through her door, taking what they needed and never once offering anything in return. Shannon had come into their lives as a guest. She had been invited, welcomed, even supported. But now she was staking her claim in ways Carolyn couldn't ignore. "Not hers," Carolyn said, her voice quiet but unwavering. She couldn't meet Haley's eyes right away. But she felt the weight of the statement land between them like an accusation. Haley didn't respond immediately, just letting the words hang there, suspended in the quiet space. Carolyn could almost hear the unasked questions in her friend's head. Why hadn't Shannon been added to the deed? Why did Carolyn insist on this? The truth was simple. Carolyn didn't trust Shannon, not in the ways that mattered. And maybe, just maybe, she had always known this day would come. She leaned forward, pulling the deed from the stack of documents they had been reviewing. It was the one piece of paper that had the power to shift everything, the thing that would tell Shannon that she had been living in Carolyn's world all along, not the other way around. She opened it slowly, letting the creases of the paper unfold in her hands, the ink still sharp. The words crisp. 68% ownership, Carolyn said, pointing to the number she had already highlighted in bright yellow. She traced the mark with the tip of her finger, as if grounding herself in the fact. Haley leaned in closer, her expression unreadable. "You've been paying this off for how long?" Carolyn didn't answer right away. She had paid off the mortgage years ago, with every penny she had saved, with the work she had put in over decades. But it wasn't just about money. Not really. It was about control. The house was hers, even if Evan was technically a part owner. But it wasn't just about the deed. It was about the years she had invested in keeping the house running, in maintaining the walls, the garden, the roof over their heads. It was about the quiet sacrifices that went unnoticed. The things that had built this place into more than just a structure, more than just bricks and beams. I didn't want her to have any claim, Carolyn said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The truth had been sitting there, simmering beneath the surface, and now it felt too heavy to ignore. Haley took a breath, as if processing the weight of the situation. She opened another folder, one Carolyn hadn't even noticed, and began sifting through the tax filings. The house, the payments, the work. It was all documented. She had kept every receipt, every statement. Every penny was accounted for. It had taken years, but she had done it. And now it would be the proof she needed. "You did the right thing," Haley said, finally meeting Carolyn's gaze. "This is your house. She's been taking advantage of you. Of all of us." "Really?" Carolyn didn't respond. She simply nodded, though her chest tightened. The words felt like a verdict, and yet, she wasn't sure she agreed. There was a part of her, one that had quietly carried the burden of motherhood, of caregiving, that still wanted to believe the best in her son's wife. But it had become too clear. Shannon didn't care. She had been given a place to stay, to call home temporarily, and she had overstayed her welcome. It wasn't the dishes, or the phone calls, or the lack of acknowledgement. It was the way Shannon dismissed her, the way she had begun to act like this house was a gift Carolyn owed her. Carolyn closed the deed, sliding it back into its folder, and looked at Haley with newfound clarity. "I'm done being invisible," she said. The words were quiet but final. Haley didn't need to say anything more. She simply picked up her coffee, took a sip, and smiled. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, one that transcended words. In the next room, the house was still and silent, but outside, the wind was picking up, carrying with it the promise of change. Carolyn could feel it in the air, like the last breath before a storm. She didn't know what was coming next, but she knew one thing for certain. It would be her turn to take control, and she wasn't going to let anyone forget it. The door to Rachel Purnell's office swung open with a soft, professional whoosh, and Carolyn stepped inside, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and finality settle in her stomach. The office smelled faintly of mahogany, old books, and leather, impressions of authority and experience. Dark wood shelves lined the walls, filled with rows of legal tomes and certificates, their presence an unspoken promise of power. A large antique desk stood at the center of the room, its surface cluttered with papers, a silver letter opener, and a half-empty coffee mug. Rachel stood to greet her, her movements smooth, her demeanor warm but precise. She was the kind of woman who commanded respect with just a glance, sharp eyes, a controlled smile, a posture that said she'd seen it all. Carolyn felt a fleeting wave of doubt as she took a seat, but it vanished the moment Rachel sat across from her, her gaze already sharp, assessing. Rachel's dark brown eyes flicked over the binder Carolyn had brought with her. The corners of the binder were worn, as if it had been opened and closed too many times, a small but constant reminder of the weight it carried. It was full of papers that mattered, documents, receipts, statements. Carolyn slid the binder across the desk, a gesture as deliberate as it was telling. "My daughter-in-law believes I contribute nothing," Carolyn said, her voice steady but quiet, like a needle piercing through the air. The words didn't come out with anger or bitterness. They were simply a statement of fact. Rachel's lips twitched ever so slightly. She opened the binder without hesitation, scanning through the first few pages. Carolyn watched her, feeling a strange sense of distance, as though the woman sitting across from her was someone entirely removed from the mess she was about to wade through. "You've kept everything," Rachel said, her voice light with approval. "Every receipt, every statement. It's all in order." Her eyes flicked up to Carolyn's, measuring. "Impressive." Carolyn nodded, but there was no pride in her response, just the quiet weight of necessity. "It was the only way to be sure," she said. The papers represented her life's work, her sacrifices, the things no one had noticed. They were more than just records. They were proof. Rachel flipped to the deed, her fingers brushing over the marked-up pages. "This house is yours," she said, as if it were a fact Carolyn had always known but never fully acknowledged. "Your name is primary on the deed. The mortgage payments? All in your hands." Carolyn felt a tightening in her chest, an almost imperceptible release. There it was again, the confirmation she'd needed. She wasn't imagining it. It was real. "Shannon has no claim here," Rachel continued, her voice professional, neutral. "She's been living here for over a year without any legal right to do so, and based on your documentation, she's never contributed a dime to the ownership." Carolyn swallowed, the tension in her throat thickening. It wasn't just the house. It was everything. Every argument that had simmered beneath the surface. The broken promises, the hurt, the feeling of being unseen. Rachel adjusted her glasses and pulled a legal pad toward her. She began jotting notes, quick, confident. "We'll proceed with a formal eviction. No noise, no early warning. You're in the right, Carolyn. And we'll make sure it's clear that this isn't personal. It's legal. Just business." Carolyn nodded, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. She wasn't sure how it had come to this, but she knew it was the only way to regain control of her life. No more silence. No more invisibility. Rachel paused, glancing up at her. "This won't feel good for her," she said, her voice low, but her eyes were steady, not without empathy but also without hesitation. "It'll feel legal, cold, impersonal, and that's the point." Carolyn felt her heart rate pick up. She had expected the process to feel like a hammer coming down, but hearing Rachel say it, hearing the words put into a reality she couldn't deny, made it feel all the more real. The finality of it, the consequence. Shannon would be forced out, just like that. No more games, no more pretending. And Carolyn wasn't sure if she was ready for that. She wasn't sure if anyone was. But she didn't flinch. "I want it done," Carolyn said, her voice quiet but absolute. There was no question in her tone. No room for second thoughts. This was the moment, the turning point. And it had already begun. Rachel nodded, her gaze flickering back to the papers. "We'll start the paperwork immediately. I'll file it next week. 30 days notice. The clock will start ticking the moment she's served." Carolyn absorbed the words, each one landing with a heavier weight than the last. 30 days. 30 days of waiting, of silence, of knowing it was coming but not yet here. The air in the office felt charged with something she hadn't fully realized until now. The process was already set in motion. The woman across from her had taken her concerns and transformed them into something solid, something tangible. And now, Carolyn knew, she couldn't stop it. "Thank you," Carolyn said, her voice quieter than before. She wasn't sure if she was thanking Rachel for the legal steps, or for the clarity she had given her, or for simply being the one to hold the weight of the truth. Rachel smiled, her expression cool but understanding. "You've got this. It's time to take back what's yours." As Carolyn stood up to leave, she couldn't help but glance at the door, the world beyond it. The air in the room seemed to hum with anticipation. Her life, her home, on the cusp of something she couldn't undo. She was no longer waiting for permission. This time, she was making her own decisions. And when she walked out of that office, She would step into a new chapter, one where silence would no longer be her only option. The 30-day countdown had begun. It started with the sound of Shannon's voice drifting up the staircase. Too bright, too polished. The kind of voice she used when she wanted the world to think everything was perfect. Carolyn paused halfway down the hall, a laundry basket tucked under one arm, and listened. "And this is our kitchen." Shannon's voice rang out, lilting with false cheer. Carolyn followed the sound to the living room and froze in the doorway. Shannon was holding her phone at arm's length, smiling into the camera as she panned across the open floor plan. The hardwood floors gleamed, the light caught just right on the countertops, the same ones Carolyn had scrubbed earlier that morning. "Our home's finally coming together," Shannon said to the lens, her reflection beaming in the stainless steel oven door. "We've been so blessed to find this place, totally worth the upgrades." Carolyn stayed silent. She watched from the edge of the doorway, her face unreadable. Blessed to find this place. The words clung to her like static. She'd lived here for 32 years. Every baseboard, every dent in the drywall, every creak in the stairs carried her fingerprints. Shannon's voice floated around like cheap perfume, sweet, heavy, overstaying its welcome. Shannon walked through the dining room now, narrating as she went. "We redid this wall last week. The peel and stick backsplash? Total game changer." Carolyn's eyes dropped to the backsplash, cheap vinyl tiles printed to look like marble. She could still see the unopened package on the counter from the day before, receipt tucked neatly beside it. The receipt she'd paid for. Shannon hadn't even bothered to hide it. The irony wasn't lost on her. She turned and went upstairs, the sound of Shannon's cheerful commentary fading behind her. In her bedroom, Carolyn set the laundry basket down and sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands were steady, though her jaw was tight. She didn't rage. She never did. She simply stared at the wall for a moment, letting the anger settle into something more useful. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Haley. "Got your email. Swinging by in 10. When Haley arrived, Carolyn was already by the window, curtain drawn back just enough to see Shannon filming in the yard now, giving a tour of her garden. The winter air made Shannon's breath visible in little white clouds as she smiled at her screen. Haley took one look at Carolyn's face and raised an eyebrow. "She's got followers now?" Carolyn's lips curved just enough to hint at something colder than humor. "Not for long." Haley smirked, setting down a reusable grocery bag full of files. "Rachel called. She's drafting the notice today. Certified. No surprises." Carolyn nodded once, her focus still fixed on the woman below. Shannon was adjusting her phone for a better angle, showing off the patio furniture. The set Carolyn had bought on clearance last spring. She was talking about how they'd curated the space to feel warm, inviting. Warm, inviting. As if Carolyn were just some old tenant cluttering the background. "Remember when she said it was temporary?" Haley asked quietly. 3 months, Carolyn said. "That was 15 months ago." For a while they didn't speak. The hum of the house filled the silence. The furnace cycling on, the faint sound of Shannon's laughter filtering through the glass. Haley leaned on the windowsill beside her. "You're handling this better than I would." Carolyn didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her calm wasn't forgiveness. It was strategy. Down below, Evan stepped into frame, looking uncomfortable. Shannon angled the camera toward him, chirping, "And here's my husband. He's been helping with all the Reno stuff, right, babe?" Evan smiled weakly, nodding. He said something indistinct, then disappeared from view, retreating into the house like a man walking into fog. Carolyn's chest tightened, not with pity, but with resignation. Evan had chosen his quiet. She wouldn't hold it against him anymore. Shannon, still live streaming, spun toward the door. "And that's the tour. Let me know what you think in the comments. Oh, And don't forget to follow for more home inspiration. She blew a kiss at her phone before ending the video. Carolyn closed the curtain. She's turning my house into content, she murmured. Haley exhaled through her nose, her expression edged with disbelief. Then let's give her something new to post about. Carolyn glanced at the files peeking from Haley's bag. The top one was labeled in crisp black ink. Eviction, Shannon Ames. The sound of Shannon's laughter drifted faintly up the stairs. It was the same laughter that used to fill the kitchen during Sunday dinners, before things had turned sour. Now, it sounded hollow. Carolyn's phone buzzed again. A new message from Rachel appeared on the screen. Draft complete. Need your signature to proceed. Her pulse quickened. She looked toward the hallway, listening to Shannon's footsteps move through the house. The same steps that would soon echo for the last time. She typed back a single word. Tomorrow. As she set the phone down, a gust of wind rattled the window pane. Outside, snow had begun to fall in slow, deliberate flakes. Soft, but steady. The kind that coated everything quietly before anyone realized how deep it had gotten. And somewhere downstairs, Shannon's laughter stopped. The first light of dawn was barely peeking through the blinds when the knock came. Soft at first, hesitant, like a whisper trying to make itself heard. Carolyn didn't need to check the clock. She already knew it was 6 a.m., the time Rachel had promised. Downstairs, she could hear the shuffle of feet, the murmur of voices just beginning to stir in the house. The calm before the storm. Carolyn moved quietly, her footsteps muffled by the carpeted hallway, until she reached the front door. There it was. A single piece of paper tucked in a weathered envelope, the edges curling slightly from the damp air. The official eviction notice. Carolyn's fingers brushed against the envelope as she slid it out of the holder. Her name was printed on the top in neat, professional font. But it wasn't hers that mattered. It was Shannon's. She turned the paper over carefully, reading the text that Rachel had prepared. The standard language, the legal jargon, all the formalities were in place. But Carolyn's eyes weren't on the body of the document. They were focused on the last line, the one she had added herself. Handwritten in sharp, deliberate ink. Effective due to lack of contribution. She paused for a moment, letting the words settle in her chest. They were final. Decisive. Not angry, but they carried the weight of everything she had endured in silence. Shannon had taken so much for granted. Carolyn wasn't just evicting her from the house, she was evicting the entitlement. The disrespect. She slid the paper back into the envelope with a single, careful motion. Outside, the early morning chill bit at the air, but she didn't hesitate. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, the wind catching her hair, carrying the faintest scent of snow that would soon blanket the ground. The door slammed shut behind her, and she posted the notice on the door with the same deliberate calm. The paper stuck against the wood with a soft rustle. A final act. The clock had started ticking. 30 days. 30 days for Shannon to pack her things. 30 days for her to face the reality of what Carolyn had set in motion. The house seemed quieter after that, as though the air itself had shifted. Carolyn stayed on the porch for a few more moments, feeling the cold air on her skin, watching the last remnants of night retreat behind the horizon. In the distance, the sound of an engine starting broke the silence, and Carolyn glanced over her shoulder. Evan was pulling out of the driveway in his car, heading off to work. His departure as predictable as the sun rising. She didn't say anything to him. She hadn't asked him to do anything. The decision had always been hers, and in that moment, it felt right to keep it that way. Inside, the quiet house waited. The coffee pot was already brewing when Carolyn returned to the kitchen. Haley was at the counter, her arms folded, looking at the door where the notice was now displayed. "Ready for this?" Haley asked, her voice low, an edge of concern beneath her words. Carolyn picked up the coffee pot, her fingers wrapped tightly around the handle. She poured herself a cup, the dark liquid spilling into the mug in a steady stream. Haley raised an eyebrow. "Cream?" she asked, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Carolyn shook her head, her face unreadable. "No, black." Haley poured herself a cup, then settled at the table, her expression steady. "You know she's going to flip when she sees that." Carolyn nodded, her eyes fixed on the dark swirl of coffee in her cup. She could almost feel the chaos waiting on the other side of the door, the storm that would break once Shannon saw what had been done. She wasn't worried. She had done everything by the book, kept everything above board, and still, the house felt like a battlefield. The kitchen was silent except for the soft hum of the coffee machine and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Haley waited, the tension between them thickening. But Carolyn didn't mind it. She had never been afraid of silence. It wasn't until the sound of footsteps approached from the hallway that Carolyn stirred. She knew what was coming. She could hear Shannon's voice rising, shrill, accusing, the unmistakable sound of someone about to lose control. The door banged open, and Shannon stood there, eyes wide, face flushed with disbelief. Her gaze dropped immediately to the notice on the door. "No," she said, almost breathless. "No, she can't do this." Evan stood behind her, his face pale, his mouth open in a wordless attempt to intervene. But Shannon didn't wait. She turned on him, her voice rising in a frantic screech. "How could you let her do this to me? She's kicking me out. This is our house, Evan. Our house." Carolyn didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply watched as Shannon's anger swelled and spilled over, a tide that Carolyn had known was coming. Evan said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his hands in his pockets. His silence was deafening. Shannon turned to Carolyn, her eyes wild. "You can't do this," she shouted. "You don't own me. You don't own this place." "I own this house," Carolyn said quietly, her voice cutting through the chaos. Her eyes locked with Shannon's. "I've paid for it. I've maintained it. And now, I'm asking you to leave." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension hung thick in the air, but Carolyn held her ground. It was done. The notice had been filed. The clock was ticking. Shannon had no choice but to face it. In the background, Haley sipped her coffee, her gaze flickering from Carolyn to Shannon, waiting for the storm to break. And somewhere outside, the snow began to fall again. The house was thick with tension, the air crackling like a storm was brewing, even though the snow had already settled into a blanket of stillness outside. Shannon paced in front of the door, her hands flailing as she rattled off random housing laws that Carolyn knew, without a doubt, were completely out of context. She was trying to hold on to control, to reclaim the narrative, but her words were turning into a string of legal jargon she had clearly pulled from a Google search. Frantic, imprecise, and desperate. "I'm telling you, this isn't legal," Shannon snapped, her eyes wide with panic. "I have rights. There's no way she can just kick me out like this. There are laws, tenant rights. You can't just do this. There's gotta be—" Carolyn didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. She had heard it all before in 1,000 different ways. Angry, frantic, pleading. Shannon was scrambling, grabbing at anything she could to stop what was happening, but Carolyn knew it was too late. The legal steps had been taken. The decision had been made. No matter how many laws Shannon threw at her, it wouldn't change a thing. Shannon turned abruptly to face her, almost wild in her frustration. "I'm serious. You can't just—" She faltered, noticing Carolyn's silence for the first time. "You're not even listening to me, are you?" Carolyn's gaze remained steady, calm. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a card. No words. She simply held it out toward Shannon, who stared at it, confused for a moment before taking it from her hand. The name on the card was unmistakable: Rachel Purnell, the attorney who had crafted this whole process with careful precision. "There's a number for you to call," Carolyn said quietly. "Rachel's your best shot. But I'm not going to argue with you anymore." Her voice wasn't cold. It wasn't angry. It was just final. Shannon snatched the card from Carolyn's hand, her fingers trembling. She looked at it for a moment, her jaw tightening. Then, without another word, she stormed out of the room, heading straight for her phone. Carolyn didn't follow. She didn't need to. It was only after a few minutes of dead silence that Evan spoke. His voice was low, hesitant, but finally, after all this time of saying nothing, he stepped into the conversation. "It's her house, Sean," Evan said, his voice tight with discomfort. He stood in the doorway, his back to the hallway as he glanced at Carolyn. "It's always been hers. You knew that." Shannon froze, the words hanging between them like a weight too heavy to ignore. Her face flushed, but she didn't turn to Evan. Instead, she held the card in her hand like it was a lifeline, her fingers digging into it as though she could squeeze some kind of reprieve from it. "I know!" Shannon shouted, whirling around. Her voice was raw now, the frantic edge giving way to something more desperate. "But she didn't have to do this. I'm family. She could have just let me stay. She didn't have to." But Evan didn't say anything more. He simply turned and walked back down the hallway, his footsteps disappearing as quickly as they'd come. His silence stung in a way that no harsh words ever could. Shannon let out a frustrated scream, then crumpled onto the couch, her shoulders shaking with the weight of everything she couldn't control. But Carolyn didn't flinch. She had seen this coming, had heard the arguments in her head long before they were ever voiced. Shannon was losing everything, and she was doing it alone. Carolyn stood up, moving toward the hallway, her mind already shifting to the tasks ahead. She didn't feel pity. She didn't feel triumph. She just felt done. She walked past the living room, past Shannon's hysterical muttering, and toward the guest closet. It was time. She had put this off long enough. The closet had been a temporary storage area for too many months, an accumulation of things Shannon had carelessly left behind. Carolyn had never touched it, not wanting to intrude on the temporary arrangement. But now, with the eviction notice served, it was hers to deal with. She opened the door to the closet, and the faint smell of dust and forgotten things hit her. Inside, there were boxes and bags scattered haphazardly. Clothes, old shoes, items Shannon had brought with her, unpacked and left to pile up. Carolyn didn't hesitate. She began sorting through it with methodical precision, pulling out discarded jackets and shoes, folding things that didn't belong to her but now felt like they had overstayed their welcome. Each piece she touched felt heavier than the last. She wasn't angry. She was simply taking back control. This space, this house, had always been hers. It had always been her responsibility, and now she was reclaiming it, bit by bit. Every shirt, every shoe, every item of clothing she folded into a box was a symbol of the boundaries she had allowed to blur for too long. A quiet knock on the door broke her concentration. She stood still for a moment, hesitant. Then she heard the soft, familiar voice of Haley from the other side. "Everything all right?" Haley asked, a quiet knock of her own accompanying the question. "Fine," Carolyn answered, her voice steady. "Just cleaning up." As she closed the closet door, the weight of the house, of all the years she'd lived here, seemed to settle back into place. She hadn't realized how much of herself she'd let slip away in the name of keeping the peace, of maintaining the illusion that everyone's comfort was more important than her own. Now, with the eviction notice served, with Shannon scrambling to find a lawyer who wouldn't take her case, everything was falling back into order. The doorbell rang. It wasn't Rachel. It was Shannon's frantic, drawn-out attempt to gain the last bit of control she could muster. But Carolyn wasn't listening anymore. By the time Carolyn had finished cleaning out the guest closet, the storm inside the house had settled into a different kind of chaos. The kitchen, once filled with Shannon's manic energy and invasive presence, had quieted. But it wasn't peace. It was the cold silence that followed a conflict. A silence that told Carolyn everything she needed to know. Shannon was going to fight. She always did. It started with the phone buzzing on the counter, a message notification from Haley. "Shannon's at it again," the text read. "Check her social media." Carolyn hadn't been on Facebook in years, but it didn't take long to see the post. A picture of Shannon standing outside the house, holding a duffel bag, her face twisted in what could only be described as theatrical despair. The caption was a sharp, biting statement. "Thrown out by my evil mother-in-law. No warning, no compassion. Just kicked out into the cold with nowhere to go. Heartless, by family, betrayal. Living nightmare." Carolyn stared at the screen for a moment, her fingers hovering over the phone. She didn't flinch. She didn't feel outrage. She just felt exhausted. Shannon's ability to twist reality had always been her strongest trait, an act of survival in her world where nothing was ever enough. Now it was a weapon, a tool to rally sympathy, to make her the victim, to paint Carolyn as the villain. Without a word, Carolyn opened the screenshot function on her phone and captured the post. Every word, every hashtag immortalized in pixels. It wasn't anger that made her act. It was practicality. Shannon was playing a game, and Carolyn wasn't going to let her control the narrative. She wasn't going to be painted as the monster. Haley's voice crackled through the speaker on Carolyn's phone just as the image was saved. "The sympathy parade has begun," she said with a touch of bitterness, her tone resigned. "She's going to get a lot of people on her side, Carolyn. You know that." Carolyn leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the phone in her hand, the weight of it sinking in. She had known this would happen. Shannon was good at being loud, at being seen, at making herself the center of attention. She had the audience, the followers, but what she didn't have was the truth. "I'm not worried about it," Carolyn replied, her voice low. "It's not the first time she's made me the bad guy. It won't be the last." Haley's laugh was humorless. "Just be ready. You know she's going to twist every word you've ever said, every action you've ever taken. She'll make herself the martyr, and you'll be the one with blood on your hands." "Let her," Carolyn said, her words slow but certain. "I'm not the one telling lies." There was a pause, a long one, before Haley responded. "Rachel's drafting up a cease and desist for defamation if it escalates. It's not like it'll do much, but it'll give you some legal ground to stand on." "Good," Carolyn murmured, her gaze wandering to the empty chairs at the kitchen table. It was strange, how still everything felt now. The space felt more hers than ever before, and yet it was hollow in a way. Empty in a way she hadn't expected. "I'll get the papers ready," Haley said, her voice tight with something close to concern. "Just don't let her get to you." "I'm done letting her get to me," Carolyn replied quietly, her fingers gently tapping the edge of her coffee mug. "This is my house. It always has been." As she ended the call, Carolyn set the phone down and looked out the window. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft, relentless. It covered the world in a kind of quiet, one that made everything feel still. But inside, she knew, things were only just beginning to unfold. The doorbell rang again, sharp and insistent, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the clock. It was too early for anyone to be visiting, but then, she wasn't sure why she had expected any different from Shannon. She walked to the door, her feet light but sure, her pulse steady. She opened it. There stood Evan, his face drawn, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his jacket. He looked as though he hadn't slept, his eyes red-rimmed and tired, but not from a lack of rest. from the weight of the world pressing on him. "Mom," he said softly, his voice hoarse, I don't know what to do anymore." Carolyn didn't respond immediately. She let the silence hang for a moment, then stepped aside, motioning for him to come inside. He hesitated but then walked in, his gaze downcast, his steps slow. Without a word, Carolyn handed him a cup of coffee. She didn't ask about Shannon. She didn't chase after him, trying to get him to say what wasn't there. Evan was his own man, but this was the life he had chosen, and now he had to live with it. "Want cream?" Carolyn asked quietly as she poured the dark liquid into his cup. "No. Black." For a moment they stood in the kitchen together, the familiar quiet of the space wrapping around them. The weight of the day was heavy, but Carolyn could feel the air shift. The kitchen, this space that had always been the heart of her home, was finally hers again. Evan sat down at the table, swirling his coffee slowly. His silence wasn't one of defiance anymore, but resignation. It was a silence she knew all too well. The quiet of someone who had lost the ability to speak for themselves. She didn't push him to talk. There was nothing left to say. And outside, the snow kept falling. The list on the wall had always been a symbol of shared space, of the unspoken agreement that everyone would pitch in, do their part. It was a simple thing. A whiteboard, scratched with days of the week, names beside each chore. Dusting, dishes, vacuuming. It was the kind of thing that kept the house running, kept the peace, and for months it had gone largely ignored by Shannon. Carolyn had filled the lines, as she always did, marking off what she had completed in the quiet rhythm of the house. But today, it was different. She stood in front of the board, the dry erase marker in her hand, feeling its weight as she contemplated the simple task of erasing the names. Her fingers tightened around the marker. She didn't need to look at the list to know which name had been on it the longest. Shannon's name, the one that had been placed there first, had never been checked off. Not once. Not even after she'd taken over the house as if it were her own. Not even after she'd turned it into content for her social media followers. The line she'd drawn between the chores, between their roles, their responsibilities, had been a faint boundary, a polite attempt at balance. But that line had been crossed too many times. And now, with everything that had transpired, the only thing left to do was erase it. The sound of the marker scraping the board was louder than she expected, like a declaration that everything had shifted. It felt like a clean break, the weight of it settling in her bones. She stepped back, watching the blank space where Shannon's name had once been. It was simple, but in that moment, it felt final. She didn't need the list anymore. The house was hers, and Shannon wasn't going to be part of it any longer. Carolyn moved down the hallway, the sound of her footsteps heavy on the wood floors. The laundry room door clicked shut as she turned the knob, locking it for the first time in years. The key slid into place, the click sharp in the quiet house. It had always been a shared space, a part of the routine. Washing clothes, folding them, sorting through the mess. But now it felt like another line, drawn not just between chores, but between what she had tolerated and what she would no longer accept. She wasn't going to leave room for more of Shannon's things. Not anymore. Rachel had been clear in their last conversation. "Just be ready," Rachel had said, her voice calm but firm. "If she tries to push back, we may need to prep a second notice. This won't be over with just one." Carolyn knew she was right. This wasn't over. Shannon would fight. But Carolyn wasn't going to flinch. She would stand firm, no matter how messy it got. She had already drawn the line. Now she was reinforcing it. The phone buzzed again, pulling Carolyn from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, seeing a message from Haley. "Shannon's on the phone with her mom. Nothing productive, just a lot of crying and blaming. You ready for the fallout?" Carolyn smiled faintly. She was ready. In fact, She'd been ready for this moment for a long time. She had lived with the fallout long enough. It was Shannon's turn now. Without replying, Carolyn moved to the drawer in the kitchen and pulled out a small card. She scribbled a quick note. The new Wi-Fi password. Something Shannon wouldn't need anymore, but it felt satisfying to put the final stamp on the separation. It was petty maybe, but it was hers to do. As she placed the card on the counter, there was a knock on the door. Not the frantic hammering of Shannon, but the familiar soft tap-tap of Haley, the sound of someone who understood the weight of the silence in the house. When Carolyn opened the door, Haley stood there holding a small, neatly folded bundle in her hands. Carolyn raised an eyebrow, unsure of what it was. Haley stepped forward, her lips curling into a small smile. She held up the item she had brought, a new welcome mat. It was simple, plain, but the words on it spoke volumes. "Yes, it's my house," Carolyn read aloud, her voice quiet, almost reverent as she took the mat from Haley's hands. Haley's grin widened. "It seemed appropriate. Thought you might like it." Carolyn laughed softly, shaking her head. "I can't believe you bought me a doormat." "Thought it was better than a go-away sign," Haley teased, her tone light. For the first time in days, Carolyn felt something shift. Something light. Something unburdened. "Thanks," Carolyn said, her voice a touch softer now. "I think I'll put it right outside the door." Haley lingered for a moment, her eyes studying Carolyn as if looking for signs of weakness, for cracks in the armor. But there were none. Carolyn stood taller now, her posture steady, her resolve unwavering. She had done what needed to be done. She had erased the line, locked the door, and changed the password. The rest was up to Shannon. Haley dropped the mat by the door and turned to leave, her footsteps light against the floorboards. As she reached the front steps, she paused and glanced back at Carolyn, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "You're really doing it, aren't you?" she asked. Carolyn nodded, her eyes steady. "I've been doing it all along." The door clicked shut behind her, and Carolyn stood in the quiet hallway for a moment. She let the weight of everything, the decisions, the actions, the silence, settle around her. The house was hers now, and no one, not even Shannon, could take that from her. The courtroom was small, the air dense with the murmur of voices. Even though it wasn't the first time Carolyn had found herself here, it felt different this time. The same dark wood paneling, the same dull beige walls, but now it carried a different weight. She sat at one end of the table, Rachel beside her, and Shannon at the other, her face red, eyes wide with the sting of her last card being played. Shannon's mother, seated behind her, was whispering something. Words of comfort or justification. Carolyn couldn't be sure. But Carolyn didn't look at them. Her focus was on the judge, Judge Molly Keene, who was sorting through papers with a quiet, controlled efficiency. The judge didn't flinch, didn't give anything away. Carolyn admired that in her, the way she wore authority like armor. Shannon, on the other hand, was falling apart. Her voice wavered as she stood up to speak, the emotion far too raw, far too vague. "I've done everything for this family," Shannon said, her voice rising. "I've supported my husband through layoffs. I've stayed here. I've contributed. And now I'm being thrown out like I'm nothing. This is my home too. It's not right." Her eyes darted between the judge, Carolyn, and Evan, who sat beside her, silent as always. She was crying now, but Carolyn saw it for what it was. A performance. Shannon had mastered the art of making herself the center of attention, the victim, the martyr. And now she was pleading with the judge as though the weight of her words could change the facts. "It's not just her house," Shannon continued, her voice trembling, desperate for the sympathy she hadn't earned. "I've lived here. I've cared for Evan. I've been part of this family. You can't just let her do this." Carolyn didn't move. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The words Shannon was saying had no weight in this place, in this court, not with the truth laid out before them. Rachel, who had been quietly reviewing documents, set them down with deliberate calm and stood up. Her presence cut through the room like a sharpened blade. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear, unwavering, "let me present the facts." She reached for the stack of papers on the table, neatly organized, the deed, the mortgage statements, the tax filings. Carolyn's name was at the top of them all. Ownership, responsibility, payment. Every single paper, every receipt was in order. No gaps, no missing details. Rachel laid it out with precision, sliding the deed in front of Judge Keene, her fingers tracing the lines, the highlights. "Carolyn Ames is the primary owner of the property in question," Rachel said, her tone flat but authoritative. "She has paid the mortgage in full for years. There is no record of any rent paid by Shannon Ames or any legal tenancy established between her and the property owner. Furthermore, no formal lease agreement exists." Shannon opened her mouth to speak again, but the judge held up a hand, her voice sharp, but not unkind. "Ms. Ames, please. We're listening to the lawyer." Rachel didn't pause. She pulled out another sheet. In addition, the occupancy timeline clearly indicates that Shannon Ames has resided in this house for 15 months, far exceeding the original temporary stay that was agreed upon. And there has been no payment of rent or any formal contribution to the property. The words landed with the finality of a gavel. Carolyn watched Shannon's face turn redder, her mouth trembling, trying to come up with something, anything, to undo what had already been said. But Rachel was simply stating the truth, and there was no arguing with it. The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable, and then glanced over at Carolyn. "Ms. Ames, do you have anything to add?" Carolyn hadn't spoken much during the hearing. It wasn't because she didn't want to. It was because she didn't need to. She had said everything she needed to say when she had filed the eviction notice. This was just the last step, and she had no intention of dragging it out. She stood, her voice steady, but with a calm finality that matched the judge's. "I've already said everything that matters," Carolyn replied. "This is my home. I've supported my son. I've supported my family. But this is mine. And it's time for Shannon to leave." There it was, the words spoken, but there was no bitterness, no triumph. There was just the weight of the truth, heavy and unmoving. Judge Keene sat still for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the papers in front of her, her face expressionless. She adjusted her glasses, then looked up. "No legal tenancy," she said simply. "No rent paid. Eviction granted." The words echoed through the room like a final breath. Shannon's face crumpled immediately, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. She looked at Evan, her eyes wild with disbelief, but Evan, as always, said nothing. His shoulders slumped, his gaze downcast. The silence between them was louder than any argument. The judge stood, collecting the papers before her. "This matter is settled. I suggest you begin packing your belongings, Ms. Ames. You have 30 days. Shannon's mouth opened, a retort on her lips, but she caught herself. The weight of the loss, of everything slipping away, was too much to fight against now. She glanced at Carolyn one last time, her eyes filled with resentment, but Carolyn didn't flinch. She had made her decision, and now it was done. Rachel moved toward Carolyn, handing her the official exit form. Carolyn took the paper, but her gaze never left Shannon. Her fingers shook only slightly as she signed it, the pen moving across the page. The fight was over, and Shannon had lost. The box sat in the corner of the living room, unopened. Carolyn hadn't wanted to deal with it right away, not after everything had happened. She had given Shannon space to gather her things, to leave in whatever way she saw fit. But the box remained, and it was only after everything had settled, after the last of Shannon's loud protests had faded into the quiet, and the house finally felt like it was hers again, that Carolyn could face it. She knelt down in front of it, the cardboard edges frayed from the move, the tape still half torn along the top. It wasn't much, just a box of things Shannon had left behind, the remnants of a life that never truly belonged here. Carolyn's fingers hovered over the flaps for a moment before she pulled them open. The first thing she saw was a pile of photos, hastily tossed in without any sense of order. Some were from years ago, from when Evan had been younger, smiling with Shannon beside him. Others were more recent, photos of the house, of the garden that Shannon had so casually claimed as her own. Carolyn's breath caught in her throat for a moment, the memories spilling out like ghosts, but she didn't let them settle in. She picked up the photos and let them fall one by one into the trash bin beside her. There was no room for nostalgia in this moment, no space for the love she had once hoped would flourish, for the family she had tried so desperately to hold together. She reached into the box again, her hand brushing against something soft. A hoodie, torn at the sleeve. It had been Evan's once, back when he had still been living at home. Carolyn picked it up, running her fingers over the worn fabric, the smell of him lingering in the fibers. She felt a pang of something. Sadness, maybe, or regret. But this wasn't Evan's. Not anymore. Shannon had worn it enough for it to carry the same weight as everything else in this box. Discarded, temporary. Without a second thought, she tossed it into the trash too, the fabric crinkling as it settled on top of the photos. There was one more thing left, wedged in the bottom of the box. A small note, folded neatly but carelessly, as though it had been crumpled up and then straightened out again. Carolyn opened it with slow fingers. Sorry it went this way. The words were simple, empty almost. Carolyn held the note for a moment, her gaze lingering on the ink that had been scrawled in haste. It was all Shannon could muster after everything. Apology without responsibility. A gesture without meaning. But Carolyn didn't hesitate. She folded the note and placed it in the drawer with the rest of the papers. The official notices. The documentation that would outlast Shannon's transient claims. She filed it away quietly. No dramatics, no show, just the finality of it. The rest of the box was empty now, but it wasn't done with yet. There was still the task of making this house her own again, of removing the last traces of Shannon, not just from the walls but from the space that had always been Carolyn's. The doorbell rang just as she stood up. She opened it without checking the peephole, knowing who it was before the door swung fully open. Haley stood on the other side, her arms laden with cleaning supplies, a mop tucked under her arm and a spray bottle dangling from her hand. "I thought I'd come help with the last of it," Haley said, her eyes scanning the room. "There's a lot of dust to clear out." Carolyn nodded. She didn't feel the need to explain, didn't feel the need to justify her decision. Haley already understood, and in a way, her presence was comforting. She didn't ask questions. She just knew that this house needed cleaning, needed to be scrubbed of more than just dirt. She could see that, as easily as Carolyn could. Together, they moved from room to room, sweeping the dust of the past away with every swipe. They moved the furniture, wiped down the counters, cleaned the windows. Each task was small, but together they added up to something significant. The house began to feel more like it had been before Shannon, before the tension, before everything had been upended. At the back of the house, Rachel arrived with final paperwork in hand. She didn't need to say much. Her presence was enough. She handed Carolyn the final documents to sign, the last forms that would seal Shannon's fate. There was no fanfare, no celebration, just the quiet assurance that it was over. "Done," Carolyn said softly. signing the final paper and handing it back to Rachel. Rachel glanced at her, her expression softening just slightly. "You did what you had to do," she said. Carolyn didn't reply. Instead, she walked to the door, locking it firmly behind her. She stood there for a moment, the house still, the silence almost comforting. And then, with a finality that felt like the last exhale of a long-held breath, she changed the locks. The house was hers. No one would take that from her again. The house felt different now, quieter, more spacious. The lingering remnants of Shannon had all but evaporated, leaving a stillness that was heavy with the absence of conflict. It was only then, in the silence, that Carolyn realized how much she had been holding her breath, how much of herself she had sacrificed in the name of peace, in the name of family. She was sitting at the kitchen table when Evan finally came downstairs. The faint echo of his footsteps on the wooden floors preceded him, and Carolyn could hear the hesitation in his movements. His weight shifted from one foot to the other as he stood in the doorway, just out of view. Carolyn didn't look up. She knew he was there, knew he'd been standing there for a while. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice thick with an emotion Carolyn hadn't heard from him in years. It wasn't anger or defensiveness. It was the kind of apology that came from someone who had finally woken up to the weight of their own choices. "I should have said something sooner." Carolyn didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a deep breath and set the spoon down in her bowl. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from anger. From something more complicated. Relief, maybe, but also sorrow. So much had been left unsaid between them for so long. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his for the first time since the hearing. Evan looked different now. Not the boy she had raised, not the man she had hoped for. He looked smaller, like the years of standing in the middle had taken something from him. His shoulders were hunched, his expression raw, like he'd finally found the courage to speak what had been left unspoken for too long. "Saying something now is better than never," Carolyn replied softly, her voice steady. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a reprimand. It was simply the truth. She had waited too long for him to find his voice, but at least he had found it now. Evan swallowed, his gaze flicking to the empty chair across from Carolyn. For a moment he stood there, unsure. The tension in the room thickened as he took a slow step forward, then another, as if testing whether he truly belonged here anymore. "I don't want to put you in a tough spot, Mom," he murmured, his voice low, as though the weight of the words themselves might shatter the fragile truce they were trying to create. "But, can I stay here for a few nights? Just until I figure things out?" Carolyn didn't say anything right away. Instead, she studied him, seeing the boy she had raised, the man he had become. There was so much hurt between them, so many years of him living in the shadow of his own fear. But there was still something in him that needed her, needed home. She nodded slowly, her fingers brushing over the edge of the bowl in front of her, a gesture that felt both small and monumental. "You can stay," she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight of its own. "But there have to be boundaries." Evan looked up at her, a flicker of relief passing over his face, but Carolyn knew better than to believe it was that simple. His silence, the years of it, had carved a distance between them that couldn't be erased overnight. They could sit in the same room, share a meal, but that wouldn't make them whole again. Not yet. Not with everything they had left unsaid. "Thank you," Evan said, his voice thick with gratitude. His hands fidgeted in his pockets, the old nervousness creeping back in. But there was something new in his eyes now, something that looked like understanding. The air between them hung heavy for a moment before Carolyn stood, moving to the stove to ladle soup into 2 bowls. The scent of the warm broth filled the room, simple and comforting. She placed the bowls on the table and sat back down, keeping her gaze on the steam rising from the soup rather than meeting his eyes. Evan sat across from her, silent at first, his hands wrapped around the warm bowl, but neither of them spoke for a long while. The clink of spoon against porcelain was the only sound in the room, the space between them filled with more than just the silence of the meal. It was the silence of years, of distance, of things that couldn't be fixed with words. Finally, Carolyn broke it. "I'm glad you're here," she said, her voice soft. "But I won't pretend it's easy." Evan's gaze flicked up, and for the first time in a long while, their eyes met. Not in anger or frustration, but in something else. Something tentative, but there nonetheless. "I don't expect it to be," he said quietly, his voice rough but sincere. They ate in silence, the weight of everything unspoken hanging in the air. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were no longer on opposite sides, no longer playing roles they had outgrown. And as the soup was finished, Carolyn didn't feel the burden of her decisions weighing on her anymore. The house was hers? Yes. But so was her son. She had always known that. Now she would make sure he knew it too. The night was still young, but Carolyn felt the slow, steady beat of something that resembled peace return to the house. The same house that had been fractured, that had borne the weight of so much silence, was finally starting to heal. The fire crackled softly, the flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows across the living room. The warmth from the hearth spread through the room. But it didn't reach Carolyn's hands. Her fingers were cold as she held the spare key, feeling its weight as though it had belonged to someone else for a lifetime. This small piece of metal, this simple thing that had once unlocked the door to her home, had become a symbol of everything that had been taken, everything she had allowed to slip away. She stood in front of the fire, watching the flames. The key was familiar in her palm, but the act she was about to perform was anything but. Without hesitation, she let the key slip from her fingers, the clink of metal on the stone floor barely heard over the rush of the flames. It fell into the fire, and Carolyn watched as it caught, the metal beginning to curl and blacken almost immediately. The heat rose, and soon the key was nothing but a twisted, brittle husk of its former self. A small, irreversible gesture, but one that felt like the last act of reclaiming her space. She didn't flinch. There was no catharsis, no relief. Only the quiet satisfaction of closing a chapter that had been left open too long. Shannon had had her turn. Now it was over. The flames grew brighter as the key melted into the fire, and Carolyn let herself watch it burn. She was still, her face unreadable, as though every moment of her life had led to this. The key was gone. But more than that, it was the last of Shannon's hold on her. The last physical piece that had been part of her daughter-in-law's influence. Behind her, she heard the sound of glass clinking, and she turned to see Haley standing with a bottle of store-bought wine. Her smile was small, but genuine. The kind of smile that said everything would be okay, even if it didn't feel like it yet. "Here's to peace," Haley said, raising the glass in a silent toast. Carolyn didn't immediately take her glass. Instead, she walked over to the mantel, gazing at the clean, silent space in front of her. Everything felt different now. The clutter was gone, the remnants of battles past wiped away. There was no more noise, no more interruptions. The house, for the first time in what felt like years, was just hers. Her fingers hovered over the checkbook, the weight of the next step pressing down on her. She hadn't wanted to do it, hadn't wanted to let go of the last thread of connection. But as she pulled the check from the book and began to write, she felt only certainty. It was for the legal fees, for the filings that would officially erase Shannon's name from every document, from every record that had tied her to this house. Carolyn paused for a moment, looking at the amount, then signed the check with a calm stroke. The house was finally hers in every sense. No more loose ends, No more doubts. It had taken time, and it had taken more than she had ever wanted to give, but it was finally over. She slid the check into an envelope and set it on the table. She didn't need to say anything. There was no need for more words. No need for explanation. Everything had been said. Everything had been done. Haley joined her by the fire, taking a sip of her wine, her eyes scanning the room. She didn't ask about the check or the process. She didn't need to. There were no questions left. No reason to stir the pot again. "The house is quiet now," Haley said, her tone soft as she leaned against the mantel, watching the flames flicker. Carolyn nodded slowly. "It is," she said, her voice quieter than usual. For a moment, they just stood there, the weight of everything that had happened settling in the air between them. The fire was dying down now, the light softening as the last embers burned out. Carolyn didn't mind the quiet anymore. It was a different kind of silence, one without the weight of unresolved tension, one that didn't feel like a trap. Outside, the snow continued to fall, gentle and unhurried. It was the kind of snowfall that made everything look new again, fresh and untouched. But inside, Carolyn felt something shift. It wasn't peace, not yet. But it was the beginning of it. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She had taken back what was hers, and now she could move forward. The clock on the wall ticked softly, the sound filling the room. Carolyn took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. The house was hers again. And for the first time in a long time, she felt at home. The letter arrived 3 days after the court hearing. It sat on the kitchen table, folded in half, addressed to Carolyn in Shannon's familiar, hurried handwriting. The envelope was creased, the ink slightly smeared where the words had been hastily scrawled, but Carolyn didn't need to open it to know what it would say. She could already hear the familiar whine of justification, the wild accusations. Still, she opened it anyway. The first page was a rant. Defensive, bitter. A disjointed recount of the wrongs Shannon had perceived, each line filled with resentment. The words spilled out in fits and starts, a blur of emotional overload. Carolyn didn't need to read all of it. She already knew the story. She'd been the villain. She'd been the one who had stolen Shannon's happiness. But as she turned the second page, she found something unexpected. There, in the middle of a paragraph, almost hidden between the vitriol, was an admission. "You always scared me." Carolyn blinked. She had to read it again, her mind catching on the words, her fingers curling around the paper in disbelief. Shannon, of all people, had written this. In the middle of all the rage, this was the closest thing to an apology she would ever get. A confession wrapped in fear, not regret. Carolyn placed the letter down, her eyes lingering on the words. She had always known Shannon's power, the way she manipulated situations, the way she played people like pawns in a game. But to read that Shannon had been scared of her, made Carolyn feel a weight she hadn't expected. It wasn't the satisfaction of having been right. It wasn't justice. It was just more silence, more fear. The kind of fear that had kept Shannon from being honest, from being vulnerable. She underlined the sentence, her hand steady. "You always scared me." Carolyn set the pen down slowly and folded the letter back up. The emotion she had expected, the anger, the need to scream, was absent. Instead, there was only a quiet understanding. Shannon had never seen Carolyn as she was. Steady, unwavering. She had always seen her as a threat, a shadow. But it wasn't her strength that had scared Shannon. It was the silence that couldn't be broken by lies, by manipulation. She slipped the letter into a drawer with everything else, with the eviction papers, with the receipts that proved her ownership. It was all done now. The last of Shannon's hold was slipping away, just like the letter that would never be sent. Without saying a word, Carolyn moved to the kitchen counter and began to mix the dough. She wasn't baking for anyone. Not for Evan. Not for herself. She was just baking, because that's what she did when she needed to fill the air with something that wasn't silence. The smell of warm cookies filled the room as she rolled out the dough, pressing it gently into shapes. There was a peace in the routine, in the comfort of something so simple. The timer beeped softly in the background, a reminder that the house had returned to its rhythm, its natural pace, not forced by others, not by their demands. When the cookies were done, she pulled them from the oven, letting the scent fill every inch of the house. The kitchen suddenly felt warmer, not because of the heat, but because the weight had finally lifted. The house was hers again, in every sense. The family that had once been hers was fractured, but at least now it was whole in the ways that mattered most. Evan came down the stairs just as she finished cleaning up. His steps were slow, measured. He glanced at the cooling cookies on the counter, then back to her, his hands still stuffed in his pockets, his face tight with the weight of everything. "Mom," he said quietly, "can I help with anything?" She turned, giving him a small smile. "I need help with the light fixture in the living room. It's time to replace it." Evan hesitated for only a moment before walking over to her, a slight shift in his posture. The conversation they hadn't had yet still hung between them, but for the first time, it didn't feel suffocating. He took the tools she handed him, following her into the living room. They worked together, adjusting the new fixture, tightening the screws, making small adjustments. The task was simple, but it felt significant. When the light clicked on, the room brightened. Not just with the light itself, but with the new sense of possibility that came with it. The shadows that had lingered in the corners of the house had finally receded. As Evan stepped back, surveying the work, he looked at Carolyn again. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Carolyn saw something she hadn't seen in years: trust. It wasn't a grand gesture, not an overt apology, but in that look, there was understanding. When they returned to the kitchen, Carolyn moved to the mantel and reached for the framed quote she had kept there for so long. It had been Shannon's. Something Shannon had placed in the house years ago, a quote about staying silent and being the bigger person. Carolyn had always hated it. It had never spoken to her. Not really. She replaced it with a new one. Her own. Simple, quiet, and true. The words fit perfectly, framed in the stillness of the room. Silence isn't weakness. It was a small thing, a simple thing, but it was hers. It was something she had reclaimed. The house was hers again, and this time it felt like it was whole. Evan looked over and nodded, his gaze lingering on the framed words. "Yeah," he said softly, more to himself than to Carolyn. "It's not." For the first time in a long while, Carolyn felt the peace settle in fully, without the weight of fear or regret. The house was hers, and no one could take that from her again. The letter arrived a week later. It sat on the kitchen counter, the envelope crisp and clean, the address neat and formal. Carolyn knew, before even opening it, what it would be: a real estate offer. She'd been expecting it, even if she hadn't wanted to admit it. The house had been on the market for a few months now, quietly, under the radar. A local agent had made inquiries, and Carolyn had been patient. But now, the offer was in her hands. It was a strong one. The numbers were good. The terms were fast, the buyer eager to close quickly. The letter laid it all out: the promise of a clean break, the price that would be enough to start fresh, to take the next step, to leave this house behind, along with all the weight it carried. Carolyn sat down at the kitchen table, the offer in front of her. She read it once, then again, her eyes moving slowly over each word, weighing it, calculating. The house was hers. She could leave. She could take the money, take the offer, and walk away from the past, from the memories, from everything that had come before. For one fleeting second, she allowed herself to consider it. It would be so easy, so clean. The chance to start anew without the heaviness of this house, without the ghosts of what had been. The offer was tempting, but only for a second. She placed the letter back on the table and reached for the trash can, tossing it in with a decisive motion. There was no hesitation in the way she moved, no second thoughts. This was her home, her peace. The house wasn't just bricks and beams. It was the space where she had built a life, where she had fought for everything that mattered, and where, despite everything, she had finally found herself again. Her gaze drifted to the front door, where a faint crack of sunlight filtered through the blinds. The house was quiet now, the space fully hers again, and it felt like it was finally breathing in the way it should. It wasn't the right time to leave. Not yet. Not when she had worked so hard to reclaim it. She stood up, walking to the hallway and pulling open the closet door. The paint cans were stacked neatly on the floor, the brushes lined up beside them. It had been a long time since she'd taken a brush to the house. But it was time. She stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against her skin. The porch was a pale shade of gray, dull and tired, but it was perfect. It would be perfect with the bright yellow that had been in her mind for weeks now. A small act, but one that felt like it would change everything. It would be the beginning of something new, the mark of ownership in a world that was finally her own. The first stroke of paint felt like something new had begun. It wasn't just the porch that was being transformed. It was her life. It was the space she had reclaimed, and now she was making it hers again, bit by bit. By the time Haley showed up, the porch had taken on a new energy. The yellow paint was vibrant against the gray, bright and warm in a way that had been missing before. Haley stood at the edge of the driveway, arms crossed, her face lighting up as she took in the transformation. "You're glowing," Haley said, her voice soft but warm. Carolyn didn't smile at first. She kept painting, letting the strokes of the brush move in rhythm with her thoughts. But then, slowly, she paused, the brush hovering above the wood. "I feel like land after a storm," Carolyn replied, her voice quieter than usual, filled with something deeper than just satisfaction. It wasn't relief. It wasn't peace. Not exactly. It was something more. It was finally the freedom to breathe, the freedom to be. Haley's smile softened and she walked over, leaning against the porch railing. "I'm glad you're finding your way back." Carolyn looked up at her, the sun catching the edges of the yellow paint, making it glow even brighter in the morning light. She let out a breath, long and slow. The house was hers. The porch was hers. The silence, the stillness, all of it was hers now. And the world beyond? It could wait. She wasn't going anywhere. The brush swept over the wood again, and the first stroke of yellow became the symbol of something more, something that was hers to keep. The morning air was still cool, but there was a hint of warmth behind it, as if the sun had finally decided to hold its ground. Carolyn sat on her porch, the mug of tea cradled in her hands, watching the world outside begin its slow stretch into the day. The porch swing swayed gently beneath her, the rhythm soft and steady, like a quiet lullaby to which she had finally learned to listen. It was the kind of peace she had only ever dreamed of, the kind that came after everything had been fought for, after every silence had been filled with the truth. No more footsteps upstairs, no more hurried conversations, no more pretending. The house was still, the air fresh with the scent of new beginnings. There were no more chaotic voices, no more demands on her time, no more arguments flaring up behind closed doors. Shannon was gone. The house was hers, in every sense. And it was exactly how she had imagined it would be. Quiet, but full. Full of her own breath, her own space. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the breeze on her skin. The sound of birds and the rustle of leaves was all that broke the silence now, and the soft, rhythmic creak of the porch swing as she rocked back and forth, back and forth. From the backyard, the faint sound of Evan's voice broke through the stillness, but it wasn't the panic or the edge of desperation that had once defined him. This time, his tone was quiet, calm, respectful. Carolyn could hear the sound of tongs against the grill, the faint sizzle of something cooking. She hadn't expected much from him in the aftermath. He had been silent for too long, retreating into his own form of numbness. But now, as she sat in the stillness of the house she had fought to reclaim, there was a gentleness in the way he moved through the space, a quiet acceptance. There was no tension in the air, just the sound of him cooking outside, preparing a simple meal. Just the slow hum of life, finally in its place. Carolyn took another sip of tea, letting the warmth of it spread through her, the bitterness of it a perfect contrast to the sweetness of her thoughts. This was her life now. This house, her home, had finally become a place where peace could live, a place where she no longer had to be afraid of what it meant to belong. Her phone buzzed quietly on the table beside her, breaking her thoughts for a moment. She reached for it, her fingers brushing over the screen, and saw the message from Rachel. "You handled that beautifully." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened. The eviction, the tension, the quiet war that had taken place behind closed doors. Rachel had seen it all, had been there to guide her through it, but Carolyn had been the one to make it happen. She had taken back what was hers. She had claimed the peace that was rightfully hers, and now the house was more than just a structure. It was a sanctuary. Carolyn's lips curled into the slightest of smiles as she set the phone down. Haley's car pulled up the driveway, the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires. She stepped out, her hands full of a vase of flowers, a bright burst of color against the dull backdrop of the gray morning. She was grinning as she walked toward Carolyn, her steps light, unburdened by the weight that had been hanging in the air just weeks before. "To the woman who contributes everything," Haley said, her voice full of affection as she handed Carolyn the bouquet. Carolyn took the flowers, the scent of them fresh and vibrant, and breathed it in deeply. It wasn't an extravagant gesture. It wasn't something that could change everything, but it was a reminder. A reminder that she had always been the one to give, always the one to keep things together. And now, she was the one who had found her peace. "Thank you," Carolyn said softly, her voice steady but filled with warmth. She placed the vase on the porch table and looked up at Haley. "For everything." Haley nodded, her expression softening as she stepped back. "I'm proud of you, Carolyn. You fought for this. You earned it." "I did," Carolyn agreed, her voice a little softer now, a quiet truth she'd never allowed herself to speak before. "I fought for it, and I won." She sat back in the swing, the warmth of the sun finally breaking through the cool of the morning, the quiet of the house wrapping around her like a soft blanket. She hadn't just taken back control. She had taken back her life. And as the wind picked up again, gently moving the trees and the flowers, Carolyn's heart settled into the stillness. The house was no longer filled with tension, with chaos. It was filled with her. It was filled with peace. She thought back to Shannon's words, the words she'd read in that letter. "You always scared me." But Carolyn wasn't scared anymore. She wasn't afraid to be alone in the quiet. She wasn't afraid to stand in the middle of her own space, her own truth, and say that she was worthy of it. And as she watched the sun climb higher in the sky, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was her home, and no one, Not even Shannon could ever take that from her. My daughter-in-law said I didn't contribute anything, so I contributed her name to the eviction notice.